And for some of you who read the book, The Winding Road to Portugal, you'll recognise some of the things that I'm going to share, because I'm going to draw some key points from the introduction in the book, and then I'm going to talk a little about some of the men in the book. But more significantly, I'm going to do a little bit of a contrast and comparison to the stories in the women's book, because there are significant gender differences that are really fascinating. But the first thing I wanted to do was draw your attention to something. And I don't know if you're all aware of a couple of online bookstores specifically for expatriates, but one is the expatbookshop.com, and the other is an online bookstore for families in global transition, which is on their website as well. And both these stores have a wonderful array of books specifically about the expatriate journey. But the interesting thing is that when you take a look at the list of the books, what you'll see is that a great many of them are written by women about the female experience of moving and relocating abroad, a little like the stories in Women Who Walk, for instance. And what this does is it begs the question of how does this gender bias impact the way in which the international or the expatriate experience is portrayed. So now I'm not a researcher in this field, and of course there are researchers in our experience, the expatriate experience, so I'm not going to attempt to answer that question, but I just think it's an interesting one, and one that I actually hadn't considered when I collected the stories for Women Who Walk. But writing the companionry, the men's journey, didn't actually occur to me till readers of the Women Who Walk suggested it. And it was in February of 2019 when I caught an Uber home from Lisbon that I had a conversation with my driver. And Ramon shared some stories about leaving Angola as a refugee for London in his 20s, followed by his decision to return to Luanda to marry and have a family, followed by a series of robberies where he was held up at gunpoint. And during the last robbery, he was shot at close range. And he survived, but the emotional fallout broke his marriage, and he subsequently left Angola again, and this time for Lisbon, where he started over. Now, I was really stunned by what I heard on this Uber drive home, so much so that I asked him would he be open to a formal interview, and he agreed. And then once I completed the interview, I was absolutely convinced of the importance of collecting the stories of 20 expatriate and immigrant men, and with the intention of exploring these questions. So these questions are actually on the inside of the front cover of the book. It's sort of the way I present the content of the book. So it's, how do men navigate life at a time fraught with great uncertainty and rapid change, working and moving country to country, on their own or with the family? Is their path easy because they're men, fortuned with greater liberties than women, or do they encounter a different set of challenges, faced with the complexities of what it means to be a man today? And how do the men's stories compare and contrast to those documented in Women Who Walk? So when I began interviewing the men, I have to admit, I was carrying a set of biases and stereotypes, which I believe the men's stories would confirm. So I'll be interested to hear after we do the Q&A if you all have hold some of these biases and stereotypes. But they include: men are more adventurous than women, men are more autonomous, better resourced, have more freedom, they're less emotional, less relationship-oriented, and less attached to children. Fortunately, I was wrong. What I came to understand, or what the men taught me, is that none of us easily slots neatly into a box. Labels are simply too limiting. But by comparing the men's stories to the women's, some significant themes and gender differences, not stereotypes, did emerge. But firstly, let me give you an impression of the 20 men. They're business creatives come entrepreneurial self-starters, some of whom pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, succeeding by their own efforts. The age range is from 25 to 90, with an average age of 48. 9 of the men are married, 6 are partnered, 1 is separated and has a girlfriend, 1 is widowed and has a girlfriend, and 2 are single. 3 of the men are openly gay, 8 have children, 3 more talked of starting a family in the future, and 4 made the conscious choice not to have kids. 1 of the men has a degree in architecture, 2 have degrees in engineering, and 8 have undergraduate degrees. So I compared these statistics to the 20 women interviewed, and the most obvious differences for the discussion today are these. Most of the men are partnered. 6 of the women were single at the time I interviewed them, and those 6 still are single. So with that in mind, is it safe to say that men are more likely to seek out and be in relationship? Well, interestingly, with a bit of research, I discovered that men's tendency to partner has been linked to health. Research suggests that women who stayed single instead of marrying, and those who divorced instead of staying unhappily married, are healthier in the long term, whereas men who are married stay healthier. And reasons for this are men are less likely to seek medical help unless encouraged to do so by their partner. Women are more often the impetus behind a couple's social life, and in the absence of spousal support, men's emotional and physical health therefore tends to deteriorate compared to single and or divorced women whose social connections tend to expand. And just as an aside, this reminds me of being very much involved in international women's communities, where some of the women whose husbands have retired would lament that their husbands were so bored at home when they were out doing things with, like International Women Connect, but here it's International Women in Portugal. And there was talk of trying to encourage husbands to start up some sort of similar group, but for men, so that their husbands had something to do. We can talk a bit about that in a moment. And concerning family and children, 5 of the women are accompanying spouses. Now, I prefer this term over trailing spouse, which I find quite derogatory, as the negative connotations discount the enormous sacrifices that women make in this role. But in what is still an uncommon role for a man, 2 of the men are accompanying or supportive spouses. Andy, who's from Poland, left his job in TV journalism to come to Portugal with his wife for her career. He says he and his wife put their relationship first. It's not about the job, who has it, and where it takes us. It's about what's best for the relationship. Eric Jensen from Denmark is supportive partner and the stay-at-home parent to his or their 2 daughters. He begins his story with the statement, "Family is everything. It has always been important to me, and I'm very attached to mine." The fathers amongst the men who spoke of their children did so with a great deal of tenderness, love and affection. Several carried evident but contained sorrow around having been separated or estranged from children at various times due to work, travel, and or marriages failing. And despite the men's palpable feelings, which was quite obvious during their interviews, sadly, society does not easily grant men the space to talk about their interior lives and emotions. And in that regard, it cuts them off from their hearts. And some research even suggests that this is why there's a high rate of heart attacks in men versus women. Accepted ideas of masculinity exclude emotional vulnerability, and yet this is a profound disservice to boys and men because simply, as we know, vulnerability is essential to our capacity to build intimacy and sustain loving and healthy relationships. Within the emotional safety of an intimate relationship and family, men have the chance to connect with their hearts through the love they feel for their partner and children. And this was beautifully evident in a number of the men's stories, perhaps even more so than in the women's, which was really interesting. And maybe we can also talk a little about this afterwards. The complexity and paradox of what it means to be a man today, emotionally vulnerable and heart-connected, yet strong, in control and ready to defend, is apparent in 9 of the men's stories. Several admitted to having issues with male authority figures, and 6 more were directly involved in war or youth gangs, either acting out or on the receiving end of violence associated with bullying and or mugging. The narrative of aggression is striking in the men's stories. It was absent in the women's. Something unique to the men compared to the women is that 3 talked of disappearing. For Nelson Clark, it was about escaping the Vietnam draft. Desperate times call for desperate measures, he says. James Mayer from London says he was 18 when he decided to disappear. The pressures of living up to the academic achievements of the paternal side of his family impelled him to slip away to Paris, where he slowly found his own way, on his own terms. Detmar Goetz had built up a hugely successful business that collapsed with the 2008 global economic meltdown. He says he came to Portugal to disappear because in German culture, the shame associated with his perceived failure was absolutely unbearable. And I just want to add that these 3 men did use the term disappear. I didn't add that word to their stories by way of describing their experiences. They actually said that themselves. None of the women talked about disappearing. But disappearing reminds me of the 10 men who I approached because I wanted to interview them, but they elected not to participate. Their preference was to remain anonymous, possibly because of the belief of going public with their story they'd lay themselves bare to criticism and shaming for not having lived up to a set of ideals imposed upon them or which they had imposed upon themselves. It's very difficult to talk about a life that one feels has not met externally prescribed ideals of masculinity. One of these men mentioned tough times living in a country where he was very unhappy, inferring that he'd been suicidal. My sense was he was both fearful and deeply ashamed of the depth of his despair. Another man is gay and feared persecution should his story find its way back to his country of origin. Not even the use of a pseudonym allayed his fears. Another's work was of a very sensitive nature, such that he couldn't talk about it because it had been his life, and he therefore felt he had nothing to say. Yet another had created a persona of business success, and he was afraid if he told the truth of his life, it would blow his chances of attracting new clients. So the level of secrecy and intrigue the uninterviewed men live with was absolutely crushing to me. In contrast to the men not interviewed, women who were at ease and transparent, telling their stories, to me, embodying a comparative lightness of being. The men's stories tend to be work-focused, with travel and adventure as secondary to getting ahead and building financial security for themselves and their families, or the families that they hope to have. Not that the women interviewed were any less work-focused or focused on financial security, but the difference is their narratives were more holistic, addressing a wider range of experiences. And one such theme oftentimes was their mixed or conflicted bond to their country of origin, something the men tended not to address, which I found curious. I don't have an answer, but again, maybe we can chat a bit about this during the Q&A. Something that was unavoidable documenting the men's stories was COVID and its impact. So compared to the women, when I interviewed them, we were living in comparatively less fraught and complicated times. But by the time I finished most of the men's stories, it was last year. It was about May of 2020. And so for the final paragraph of each of their stories, which is headed, "Where is he now?"
Yeah.
I had the men talk a bit about how they'd been personally impacted. The livelihoods of all the men bar 3 were negatively impacted. The 3 were already working remotely from home, so quarantining was not an issue for them because their work was steady, and for one, his workload increased. But here's a summary, just a sort of a summary of 5 of the men actually who were impacted severely. Ramon, who I'd mentioned before, is an Uber driver. His income fell by half. He had to give up his apartment and move into the basement of a share house with his teenage foster daughter. Fernando, who ran a successful guest house, has had no tourists in over a year now. So he's trying to rent his guest house as a large family home with the intention of living off the rental income. It hasn't rented yet, but he's hopeful that this spring it will. Kevin is a writer for Lonely Planet travel guidebooks. There have been no travel assignments for Kevin since February 2020. Fortunately, his girlfriend has a steady job because they now have a 5-month-old baby. Kevin has taken on the role of primary carer while his girlfriend is back working full-time. And as a first-time dad at 48, he's doing a wonderful job as a doting and loving father, and he proudly posts baby pics on Facebook several times a week, and it's really rather gorgeous to see him with his baby son. Brothers Ben and Ricky Foran, who are in their early 30s, own a specialty coffee cafe and wine bar in Lisbon. 6 months after they opened, Lisbon went into its first lockdown last spring. Determined to do what they could to keep going, they began selling their roasted coffee beans from their website. And Ben, the younger one at 32, gets on his bike and he delivers the beans to customers all over Lisbon. Now, of course, Lisbon is hilly, not like Amsterdam, so you can have this visual of Ben with the coffee beans in a backpack on his back, riding his bike, delivering these beans all around Lisbon. They also used a GoFundMe platform to raise money to cover their cafe rent, given that over this past year, they've had to close the doors for 2 lockdowns, and that's a total of 6 months. James Mayer, who I mentioned earlier, whose business includes tours of the Douro wine region in the north of Portugal and curated food and wine walking tours of Porto conducted by young local Portuguese, closed his online bookings last spring or spring of 2020. This year, still with no tourism, he's reinvented himself, and with his skills is now writing articles, doing interviews and videos on key wine brands and producers and winemakers. And this continues to give him significant exposure as an expert in his field, with the hope that when tourism comes back, that he can open up his online bookings again for his Douro wine tours. So I think what these COVID stories reveal is the courage, resiliency and creativity the guys showed in the face of enormous financial challenges, businesses collapsing and work simply drying up. and one can't help but admire the way the men simply got to work reinventing themselves. And this may well be the nature of the entrepreneurial spirit, which in times of change, the only constant in life, is a trait that is certainly worth having. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. So thank you, everyone. And I'd love to have a chat about some of those issues that I raised, or answer any questions, or just generally chat about the men's journeys. And if you have any question about the men or gathering their stories, I'd be happy to answer those.
Louise, I think one of the surprises when we were talking last year, right, is that no one anticipated COVID or Corona crisis. In general, would you say that the mood of the men was a little deflated because of that?
No.
Okay.
I mean, obviously when they've been impacted in the way that I indicated in just those 4 stories, you would think that they would be enormously deflated. But in fact, I think that there was this feeling of we just have to be positive and think forward and be creative and keep going. So there definitely was this way of thinking that I believe is particular to entrepreneurs. The Detmar, the German chap that I mentioned, I mean, he's a serial entrepreneur, and his story goes into depth of the ups and downs of his success, failures. I mean, it's, I don't know how anyone's adrenal system could cope with those ups and downs. But he's now in a second marriage with 2 young children. He's in his 50s, and he just keeps going. He just keeps creating and coming up with new ideas. So it really is impressive the way the men have just kind of kept moving forward. When I talked at the beginning about the most obvious difference between the men and the women, which is that most of the men are in relationship, we can speculate that perhaps the resiliency is because they have very supportive partners by their side. I do think men get an enormous amount of emotional support from the women in their lives. So this may well be another reason why the men seem so resilient. Probably again, the person that is struggling the most is Ramon, because he's separated. He left his family in Angola, but then he, as I mentioned, has a foster daughter, the daughter of friends from Angola that sent her here for better education. And they have each other, and I think that they're enormously supportive of one another during this time. Plus, they have their church. They're very involved in the evangelical church, which is a hugely supportive community. So, the men do have supportive partner, family, community, in the way that I think some of the women, the single women in Women Who Walk, who are perhaps a retirement age, are a little bit more isolated during these times, because they would normally, pre-COVID times, be very dependent on the community of something like IWP or IWC. So their network of women friends is more distant these days, and I think that's harder on single women of a certain age.
We have a couple of questions. So Carol asked how you found the men for your book.
Well, it was very organic. obviously I talked about that first one. And then what happened is that at different times, perhaps I'd been at a social event or a dinner or something, and someone had mentioned, oh, have you heard about thus and such, and he's doing this? Oh, or do you know about Eric? You know, Eric's a stay-at-home dad and he's raising the girls. And so I would remember some of these stories that I'd heard. So I would follow up. I'd contact perhaps that person I'd heard about the guy from, and I'd say, would you mind if I contacted him? Could you perhaps give me his phone number or email? And so that's how it evolved. And then the more men that I learned of, it just snowballed. You know, a couple of the men said, oh, you should talk to this guy. Or then women that I knew through IWP contacted me and said, oh, you should talk to thus and such husband. He's done this or that. So then it just became like this community project with people calling me or emailing me and saying, oh, you should talk to this person or that person. But I was pretty clear about the demographic. I did want men with a fairly unique or unusual story, because I wanted to hear the voices of men that we don't normally hear. I mean, there's certainly a dominant male narrative out there, and it tends to be the corporate voice or the man with an enormous amount of success because he's out there with his product, or, you know, product me, selling whatever it is. And so we hear that dominant male narrative a lot, and I didn't want that in these stories because we're so used to that. I mean, I wanted to hear probably from kind of the average guy, you know, what is it like to just be a normal, regular guy, moving country to country, with family, without family, on your own. Tell me your story. We want to hear it. And I think because of that, there are some pretty compelling journeys in this book. And the men really did open up and share some pretty intimate details of their life, which was extraordinary.
In terms of the men, you mentioned that there were 3 that were gay, and then you also said that someone was hesitant to tell their story because of repercussions. Is it repercussions in terms of, I mean, I've been to Portugal, but I'm not really familiar with how they view homosexuality. Is it because of that, or is it more, I was just curious, like a personal?
No, he was actually from a Middle Eastern country, and I won't even say which one it was because I can hardly express the concern that he had. And his mother is still in that country, and he didn't want to jeopardise his family and his own safety in any way. So now Portugal, of course, has a very liberal attitude to homosexuality. I mean, you know, gay marriage is legal here. You see couple, I mean, probably like Amsterdam, couples openly together, men holding hands. It's just sort of part of the culture here now. But then that said, the Portuguese have this wonderful saying, which I absolutely love, actually. If you don't like it, don't look.
Another question came in. Do you keep in touch with the men and women you interview and follow up on their lives? And that's from Yvonne.
Yeah, I do. It has been a little harder because of COVID, but this might be a chance for me to say that one of the things that I've started up, because I have to do all the promotion online, you know, obviously this is a Zoom presentation, not an in-person presentation. So I'm always looking for creative ways to talk about the books and discuss the stories and so on. So one of the things that I did was I went back to a number of the men in the book, and I asked them would they be available to do mini Zoom interviews with me that I then uploaded to YouTube. So I created a YouTube channel with a playlist for mini interviews with the men, and then I've been doing mini interviews with the women. So that for anyone who's interested to see some of the men, the YouTube channel, I think, is under my name, Louise Ross, expat writer, or expat writer Louise Ross. And there you'll see 15 to 20 minute like little discussions with the men. And they read an excerpt from their story and then we talk a bit about it. And keep in mind, of course, for many of the men, it's English is their second, third language. And so you're listening to someone use English with some hesitancy. So they're pretty organic and pretty basic, but it does give readers who are interested to see the face behind the stories a visual of some of the guys. And then all of these little mini projects continue to inspire me. And so I've decided to come full circle and come back to the women's stories, because there's been increased interest in the women's book since the release of the men's book. And I've decided to do a podcast also named Women Who Walk, and to extend the interview or broaden the interviews to women outside of Portugal too. So if there are any IWC members who have a great story to tell about your journey country to country, email me please, because I've started to create a list of women that I'd love to interview. And so do let me know if you're interested to participate in that. I hope to launch mid-April, but it'll be basically gathering stories in the same vein that I did for Women Who Walk. But it'll be audio. It won't be written and it won't be visual. It'll just be audio.
We did have a question if you had ideas for new books, but I think you just covered that you're focused on the podcast. Another question that came in, so this is from Irene, was do you pay for the interviews, or do you have to give them a copy of your book after publishing?
No, I don't pay for them at all. This is because if anything, somebody should be paying me to gather these stories. Of course, I always give a book to the interviewees. And the other thing that, of course, I wanted to do for the men, knowing that, these men aren't, they're not men making an enormous amount of money. They all have their own small businesses. So I did want to give them an opportunity to mention their business, like James, for instance. So at the back of the men's book, under resources, I list all the men, and if they have a website, I list their website. So for each of the men, this was a way for them to kind of pitch what it is that they're doing. So it was actually a great opportunity for them. But I didn't want to make it in any way advertisements for them. So that's why I put it all at the back of the book under resources.
We have one more question from Cinda. She says, sometimes there's a fine line between expat and refugee. How do you differentiate the two? Thinking of the gay man from the Mideast.
Yeah. Well, no, the one from Angola. Yes. No, I define my interviewees both in the women's book and the men's book as expatriate or immigrants. And an expatriate, the definition is, it's sort of evolving these days, but in fact, I've got a little, let me see, a little definition here on my desktop. Expat meaning living abroad with the intention of sooner or later returning to the home country, in contrast to immigrant, intending a permanent move. So if, let's say, Ramon, who had gone to London as a refugee in his 20s, had come here as a refugee in his 20s, and then maybe I might not have included him because, in effect, by definition, he would be a refugee. But his story is, though it's kind of devastating, it's quite fascinating. It talk about, working your way from the bottom to the top. So he was in London or outside of London for, I think, almost 10 years. He started college. He didn't finish his college degree. He met his wife at college there. She was adamant that she wanted to go back to Angola. He didn't want to because he had grown up during the Civil War there, which is why he self-elected as a refugee. He just wanted to get the hell out. I mean, he'd grown up in it, the street violence that he was still living with in his teens and late teens, early 20s, sounded devastating. So he didn't want to go back, but his girlfriend, who ultimately became his wife, was adamant that she wanted to take her very advanced skill set back to Angola, and she subsequently did, and works in government and development there. So he did go back. They built up their life together, and they basically, grew a very successful life together. They were, young, upwardly mobile, middle-class people, doing very well. 2 of their own children, an adopted daughter. They were also funding education for underprivileged kids and so on. But then, as I say, he, just through a series of just dreadful muggings and holdups and so on, was shot. And I think just the ongoing street violence that he continued to encounter, basically, I think, compounded the PSDT, that he was post-traumatic stress syndrome, that he probably has been a lifelong sufferer of as a result of the Civil War. So he said, I'm leaving. He wanted to pack up his family and bring them all here, but his wife refused because she has this significant government job. And so I think with, a broken heart, he emigrated to Lisbon. So he came here as an immigrant, not as a refugee.
Just out of curiosity, Louise, what drove you to a podcast versus like another book?
Probably because I'm isolated at home on my own, and I think this latest lockdown has been tough personally. And the idea of, because writing a book is very isolating work, you just sort of shut yourself away and you stick your head in your computer and you're in your head and you're just focused writing. And I needed to figure out how to have more contact and how to have more conversation. I hope to do a couple of months and have these conversations with women further afield about what they're doing and where they're going and how their lives have evolved. And that's exciting to me.
And on that note, we have about 5 minutes left, and I know Marlena has some things to announce. And Louise would really like to thank you for your conversation today, and for sharing with us your new book. It was honestly just as fascinating as last time. You're definitely a fantastic interviewer. You tend to, at least it sounds as if, I haven't read this book yet, it sounds as if you're able to really gather and get into people's lives as you talk to them. So thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Well, thank you so much. It's just delightful to be connected to this group. I just find it thrilling that I kind of feel like I know some faces and know you well, and you're all in Amsterdam or the Netherlands.